Hey guys, it's KJ from the Scariest Movie Ever channel on YouTube. And what you're looking at is the Church of St. John the Divine in New York City. If you've followed my channel for any amount of time, you know I've covered this church in several videos. This church holds many mysteries, and there's lots of strange things that have happened both inside and outside of the church. There is something quite unusual with this church in that every year it has a massive Halloween celebration. How many churches do you know actually celebrate Halloween? And once you actually see footage of this festival, it's clear that this is demonic in nature. In this church, every Halloween, they're openly celebrating witchcraft, Satanism, and Satan himself. So of course it seems very strange that a Christian church would hold such an event every year on the most satanic holiday of all holidays. Even stranger still, within this church, they celebrate the solstices. And it's clear from both the New Testament and surviving accounts of Romans and Christians that pagan Rome was not a good place to be a Christian prior to Constantine the Great's conversion. Christians were routinely rounded up, arrested, tortured, and then murdered in a variety of creatively grisly fashions. Rome really knew how to turn pain, fear, and death into a spectacle that simultaneously entertained a bloodthirsty crowd, but also caused them to cow down into submission. As such, Christians had to be careful how and when they worshipped. For much of its early life, the Christian religion essentially existed underground. As the Romans were worshiping their pagan gods, Christians had no intention of not celebrating Christ's birth, death, and resurrection. The average Christian living in what was essentially hostile territory, however, recognized the need for discretion. So they chose to have Christian celebrations around the same time as pagan holidays. No one would question another family who was feasting or making merry around the winter solstice. Most of Rome was doing the same. As such, Christians who were celebrating Christmas instead of Saturnalia, or the birthday of the unconquerable sun, went unnoticed by Roman authorities or neighbors with a grudge. Even back then, they had a see something, say something scenario in place. Both pagans of old and neo-pagans tend to recognize that these solstices are actually about an exchange of power between gods, or the shifting of the god and goddess into a new form. Nature itself is worshipped. So these practices obviously are off limits to followers of Christ. Christians should not celebrate the solstice in the traditional pagan sense. Of course, there's nothing wrong with recognizing the significance of the date. The Church of St. John the Divine was also built by Freemasons. So we can go down this article here. It's giving 7 locations in New York City concerning Masonic history. And go down here to number 5, Cathedral of St. John the Divine. Even right here it says the New York City Masons contributed to the fundraising for the great cathedral, and a rendering of this church appeared on the cover of Masonic World in 1925. So there's lots of creepy connections to this church. But what makes this church most famous or infamous would be its pillars. The Pillars of St. John's Cathedral. Etched onto these pillars is a depiction of New York as the new Babylon the Great, the most infamous, luxurious, and powerful city in the world. However, these apocalyptic pillars ascribe the same tragic fate to New York as that of Babylon, illustrating the end of days for the city as it falls to the hands of God. These scenes of destruction are found on what is known as the Portal of Paradise, located on the cathedral's western facade. Added by stone carver Simon Verity between the years 1988 to 1997, there are giant waves overtaking the city, cars and buses plummeting into the waters beneath them, And there's images of scorpions, snakes, and skulls coming from a pit, and people running in chaos below the stock exchange. Perhaps the scariest scene, however, is that of New York toppling under the massive mushroom cloud of a nuclear explosion. Seeing how this building was constructed by Freemasons, it should come as no surprise we have a representative of the all-seeing eye. After studying these pillars for so many years, and again doing videos in the past about these, one of the most interesting parts of it all, to me, is right here. It may be hard for you to make out at first, but I'm talking about the second pillar to the left. And what you'll see is a baby being birthed. You'll see a baby's head essentially coming out of a woman, and underneath that baby being birthed, you have a ram's head, and underneath that ram's head you have the spiral. Far to the right, that pillar on the farthest right, that's the Kabbalist tree of life. What they're symbolizing here with the baby being born is the birthing of the Antichrist, the finalized beast system. And this is another form of lesser magic that we find so many times connected to Freemasonic magic. And we've seen similar examples of this kind of predictive programming before. Certainly one example of this would be the Georgia Guidestones, or the Ten Commandments of the Luciferian New World Order. And another example would be the murals at the Denver International Airport, just to name a few. Even here it's interesting, they're representing the entire world trapped inside the brain of the rainbow. Notice the rainbow swirling around the people is in the same shape of a brain. This is all about the hive mind of the beast system, the rainbow being one of their symbols. It's also worth mentioning the lesser magic on our money. They put their plans on paper and they called it money. If you weren't already aware, money itself is a form of lesser magic and predictive programming. Both 9/11 and the Oklahoma City bombing were both placed on money before the events. Just a few years ago, when they released the new $100 bill, it didn't take people long to figure out that on that $100 bill you could see the destruction of New York City, specifically by a tsunami created by a nuclear explosion.
I continue to be much more concerned when it comes to our security with the prospect of a nuclear weapon going off in Manhattan.
Here's another really interesting portion of the pillars I wanted to point out, and this could very easily fall into prophecy. Many of us are aware that Obama has an Antichrist spirit, and there's many people out there that believe that ultimately he will be the Antichrist. With that being said, I find it very interesting we find this on these prophetic pillars. This giant dragon coiled up here in the center with his tail literally pointing to what looks a lot like Obama. I wanted to give a little background and a little bit of history to this building before we really dig in. I found this article from February 10th, 1989 that details how important St. John's Cathedral is to the New World Order. Not just that, but also to the Luciferians, the Theosophists, the occultists. There is a very deep and rich occult history at St. John's Church. And I personally had no idea how deep it went until I stumbled across this article. So I'm going to read some of the key elements from this article connecting everything back to St. John's Church. Then after that, I'll show you some more recent information that connects all of these threads together. The Cathedral of St. John the Divine, the medieval temple of the Episcopalian Archdiocese of New York, has become the mother institution of the New Age movement in the United States, whose goal is to eclipse the age of Pisces, Christianity, with an age of Aquarius, Lucifer. The presiding bishop of the cathedral, Bishop Paul Monroe, whose family is heir to the Nabisco Company fortune, has been in the forefront of creating this satanic New World Order since at least the late 1950s when, as a priest in Indianapolis, Indiana, he gave the People's Temple cult over to Jim Jones. Later in 1977, Bishop Moore rocked the Christian world when he ordained a militant lesbian, Ellen Marie Barrett, who told Time magazine that it was her lesbian love affair that gave her strength to serve the Lord. Bishop Moore claims that the ordination of lesbians and his other Gnostic heresies are merely part of the ongoing revelation of God's truth to man by the Holy Spirit, which had been prophesied by the disciple John. With this dissembling rationale, Bishop Moore had transformed the Cathedral of St. John the Divine into a Gnostic stronghold for such organizations as the Lucis Trust, founded in 1922 by Alice Bailey, a disciple of Theosophist Madame Helena Blavatsky. Originally named the Lucifer Trust, it's become a mother institution of the modern New Age movement. The Temple of Understanding, which is headquartered at the cathedral under its president, the Very Reverend Dean James Parks Morton, Dean of the Cathedral. It has turned the cathedral into a harbor for Gnostic religions ranging from Tibetan Buddhism to Sufi Freemasonry. The medieval village of Lindisfarne, New York, which is said to be a model for the New Age lifestyle once the earth has been purified of its billion non-white souls. There is also a special ministry created for Sufi Freemasons who were a historical deployment against the Arab Renaissance, and whose modern-day cathedral affiliates have been linked to the assassination of Egyptian President Anwar Sadat. Also the creation of the Zen Center, which teaches meditation to the elite of the liberal establishment. Gay and lesbian organizations included as well, which seek to legitimize their sin by arguing that the beloved disciple John had a homosexual affair with Christ, or else by creating mother goddess religions in the cathedral's crypts. A medieval chivalric order known as the Most Venerable Order of the Hospital of St. John, which under the direction of the Duke of Gloucester of the British royal family has included the Episcopagan American establishment in such Gnostic evil as the necessity to spread Shiite fundamentalism under the Ayatollah Khomeini in Iran, because the Shah had sinned by trying to industrialize his nation. The serried ranks of the dead among Jim Jones' People's Temple cult, who had consumed cyanide-laced Kool-Aid on orders from Jones, are merely the more public casualties of the age of Aquarius, when those bearing the mark of the beast, 666, are to be unleashed upon the earth once again. Throughout the United States, the Satanic New Age movement has grown to become a major threat to the Judeo-Christian tradition upon which our republic was founded. There is a national security dimension to the growth of the New Age movement. Starting in 1982, Bishop Moore returned from the Soviet Union to warn that unless the Anglo-American establishment carried out appeasement of the Soviets, the Russians would launch a thermonuclear first strike. Moore, who entered the 1970s, quote, peace movement by visiting with the Viet Cong-controlled underground peace movement in Vietnam, had by 1983 joined with the Pro-Terrorist Institute for Policy Studies and the USA-Canada Institute of the USSR Academy of Sciences to mobilize the American peace movement to stop the Strategic Defense Initiative. 30 top Soviet intelligence officers who were joined by Bishop Moore gave marching orders to the American peace leadership to this effect in Minneapolis, Minnesota in 1983. Last February, the Cathedral of St. John the Divine hosted a February Fling, sponsored by the Temple of Understanding, which brought together top Soviet officials to meet with their counterparts in the West. Through Friar Louis Dolan, who travels to the USSR every 6 weeks to get marching orders from officials of the CPSU International Department-controlled Soviet Peace Center, the Temple of Understanding overlaps the Center for Soviet-American Dialogue, which is involved in extensive exchanges whose purpose is to remove the enemy image of the USSR and begin an evil empire. Spokesmen for the Lucis Trust believe that Mikhail Gorbachev may be the premier world leader in their externalized hierarchy, giving impetus to a plan for a new world order of Luciferian values and behavior. The Lucis Trust also carries out exchanges with the Soviet Union, where they believe triangle cells pray the great invocation for the coming age of Aquarius. These Luciferians welcome Gorbachev, who bears the mark of the beast on his forehead. The New Age movement's enthusiasm for Gorbachev is really no surprise. The roots of this movement date back to the 1870s, when Madame Helena Blavatsky was deployed by a combination of Black Hundreds forces that included the Okhrana, the Tsarist Secret Service, and the Russian Orthodox Church, to destroy Augustinian Christianity in the West, through the creation of a satanic ideology known as Theosophy. As one Theosophical Society brochure made clear, its goal was to oppose the materialism of science and every form of dogmatic theology, especially the Christian, which the chiefs of the society regard as particularly pernicious. The deployment of Madame Blavatsky into the West had been part of the same effort called the Dostoevsky Project by the theosophically inspired Frankfurt School, which led the Okhrana to unleash the Scottish Freemasonic forces of the liberal Alexander Kerensky and then the dark forces of the Bolsheviks. Among those principally responsible for deploying the hash-addicted Blavatsky into the West were Count Alexander, one-time head of the Okhrana as interior minister, whose family later joined with the Bolshevik Revolution, Imperial Privy Councillor Prince Akimov, whose correspondence with Blavatsky reveals him to be a key controller, Fyodor Dostoevsky, whose writings have regained popularity under Gorbachev because they were a 19th century revival of the Russian Orthodox Church's Fyodor Dostoevsky, whose writings had regained popularity under Gorbachev because they were a 19th century Fyodor Dostoevsky, whose writings have regained popularity under Gorbachev because they were a 19th century revival of the Russian Orthodox Church's blood and soil doctrine that Moscow would become the third and final Rome, and Mikhail Gorbachev propounded the doctrines of spiritualism that are being revived in Russia today, and who profile Blavatsky as a modern princess of Isis. Tentacles of the Blavatsky deployment extended quickly through the West. The United States in 1873, Blavatsky traveled to the U.S., where, with the spiritualist Colonel Olcott, she founded the American Theosophical Society, whose headquarters became Pasadena, California. Colonel Olcott had been involved in seances at this time on a farm in Chittenden, Vermont, with Mary Baker Eddy, who founded Christian Science as coextensive with Theosophy. Later, Olcott accompanied Blavatsky to India, which became the spiritual center of their cult. In 1883, Blavatsky's disciple Annie Besant, who later assumed Blavatsky's mantle as High Priestess of Theosophy, was a co-founder of the British Fabian Society, together with Gnostic Christians and spiritualists. In the same year, Scottish noble Doug Douglas, who had sponsored Blavatsky as early as 1858 and given seances for the Tsar, returned to Great Britain, where with support of the Cecil family, he founded the Society for Psychical Research, whose members included Arthur Conan Doyle, Lord Balfour, Lord Bertrand Russell, John Dewey, and William James. Another branch off Theosophy was the explicitly Satanist Aleister Crowley's Order of the Golden Dawn, which overlapped the predominantly Anglo-American Ordo Templi Orientis and the Thule Society in Munich, which gave birth to the Nazi Party through the good offices of Houston Stewart Chamberlain, Karl Hasshofer, Rudolf Hess, and Wagner Kriss. Alice Bailey was the founder in 1920 of the Lucifer Trust, which represented a combination of Gnostic Christianity with Blavatsky's Theosophy. Bailey's Gnostic doctrine transformed God into Nietzschean will, while Christ is considered by them merely a lowly part of the many ascended masters who form a hierarchy that is eventually to be externalized to carry out a plan for a new world order that is otherwise known to Bailey's disciples as the Age of Aquarius or the Age of the Maitreya. The Lucis Trust, which today has non-governmental organization status or NGO status at the United Nations, has been given legitimacy by the Cathedral of St. John the Divine and has spawned an array of New Age fronts, including the Temple of Understanding. Born in Britain, Alice was raised an Episcopalian before separating from her first husband, a drunken missionary to the United States who would beat her frequently. Relocated from Britain to the West Coast, she was recruited into the Pacific Grove Lodge of Theosophy in 1915. By 1920, she became editor of the American Theosophist newspaper, The Messenger. In this same year, she married Foster Bailey, a Scottish Rite Freemason and co-Mason, and she launched a fight with Annie Besant for control of Theosophy, while Alice Bailey lost when Besant's man, Louis Roger, was elected president. Immediately after the dust settled, Alice and Foster Bailey founded their own Tibetan lodge, then the Lucifer Trust, whose name was abridged in 1922 to present Lucis Trust. By the 1930s, Bailey claimed 200,000 members, and her faction of theosophy grew even more rapidly after Krishnamurti in 1939 denounced Besant's scheme to promote him as the coming Messiah. Throughout these years, Bailey spent her summers in Ascona, Switzerland, where along with Mary and Paul Mellon, she attended Carl Jung's Eranos conferences. And from their union, the Baileys established a series of fronts, which include the Arcane School. Founded in 1923, the school gives correspondence courses in meditation from its branches in New York, Geneva, London, and Buenos Aires. A brochure states, the presentation of the teaching adapted to the rapidly emerging new civilization stresses the training of disciples in group formation, a technique which will characterize the discipleship service in this Aquarian age. World Goodwill. Ever since the dropping of the atomic bomb, which is seen by these kooks as a spiritual manifestation of Luciferian light, Lucis Trust has sought to give the UN a monopoly over nuclear weapons with which to impose a one-world federalist empire upon sovereign nations. World Goodwill works directly with the World Federalists and is part of the work to externalize the hierarchy of illuminated minds, which will usher in an age of Maitreya, otherwise interpreted by Bailey to be the return of Christ, prophesied in the biblical book of Revelation. Triangles. Founded in 1937, Triangles is the name for a global network who pray together a great invocation, especially on the night of the full moon, when members of the Triangle believe they are heavily influenced by the astrological signs of the zodiac. Findhorn. This is the sacred community of the New Age movement based in Great Britain. Bailey disciple David Spangler, another explicit Luciferian, became co-director of the Findhorn Foundation when he formed the Lorien Association. He sits on the boards of directors of Planetary Citizens, the Secretariat of Planetary Initiative for the World We Choose, and is a contributing editor to New Age magazine. But Lucius is not limited to low-level Satanists. When he was Secretary of Defense in the early 1960s, Robert McNamara prayed to the full moon along the Potomac River, according to journalist Edith Roosevelt. The Lucis Trust endorsed McNamara's tenure as the head of the World Bank, which is hardly surprising since Lucius believes in the Blavatskian Great White Brotherhood, which is consistent with the Neo-Malthusian aim of the International Monetary Fund to exterminate darker-skinned races. Not only does Bailey explicitly seek to destroy the nation-state, which she equates with the idealism of the age of Pisces, but in her 1954 work, Education in a New Age, she also endorses Nazi eugenics and sex hygiene to purify the race. The Lucis Trust in 1963 founded a more distanced front group, the Temple of Understanding, which also has NGO status and worked out of the United Nations premises directly, until in 1984 it shifted its headquarters to the Cathedral of St. John the Divine in New York City. While the chairman of the temple is Judith Dickerson Hollister, those involved with its founding were the late Isis priestess of anthropology, Dame Margaret Mead of the Order of St. John, Order of St. John's Canon Edward West, and UN Deputy Secretary General Robert Mueller. The Temple of Understanding went dormant for several years after a major expose by Edith Roosevelt. The temple was then revived at the Cathedral of St. John the Divine in 1984 at a ceremony presided over by Bishop Paul Moore and the Dalai Lama. Recent activities of the temple include the Global Forum of Spiritual and Parliamentary Leaders on Human Survival, held in Oxford, England, April 11th through the 15th, 1988. Its luminaries included the Dalai Lama, the Archbishop of Canterbury, and Carl Sagan, and the Global Committee of Parliamentarism on Populations and Development, which advocates Neo-Malthusian population reduction as the solution to the world's ills. In January 1990, the Oxford Global Forum will be followed by a Temple of Understanding event in Moscow, which is being sponsored by the Russian Orthodox Church, the Supreme Soviet, and the Soviet Academy of Sciences. The main thrust of the follow-on conference will be to get world religious and political leaders working together on such neo-Malthusian ecological schemes as the greenhouse effect hoax. This is merely a global replay, which has the backing of the Soviet Union, which agreed to a Dartmouth Conference proposal in the 1960s to promote ecology in exchange for unilateral Western arms control deals. The North American Interfaith Network. It was established last year to bring together the major religions in a theocratic institutional network. Its director is Reverend Daniel Anderson, a Lutheran, who is recently co-opted to be executive director of the temple, working out of the Cathedral of St. John. The Wichita Conference, a North American Assisi. This conference, held October 30th to November 1st, 1988 in Wichita, Kansas, was in preparation for the 1993 celebration of the centennial of the launching of the, quote, New Religions movement by Chicago Roundtabler William T. Steed. Like the Global Forum, the Wichita Conference brought together American Indians, Sikhs, Sufis, Buddhists, Islamist fundamentalists, and Jews. The February Fling. This was a 2-week celebration at the Cathedral of St. John in 1988 to promote 100 prominent Soviets. It was co-sponsored by the Temple of Understanding and the Center for Soviet-American Dialogue. Catholic priest Friar Louis Dolan, who sits on the board of both institutions, was the organizer of the tour. Father Dolan is head of the Citizens Diplomacy Center of Wainwright House, which sponsors a multitude of East-West exchange programs oriented toward removing the enemy image of the USSR as an evil empire. Wainwright House's Institute for Spiritual Development was directed by Judith Hollister, the founding chairman of the Temple of Understanding. Through Father Dolan, Wainwright House has pledged to work on 4 East-West projects in 1989 with the temple. Among these is a project on ecology, for which Wainwright House has received funding from Lawrence Rockefeller to promote. So that concludes what I wanted to share with you from that particular article. Now I want to share with you a few more bits from this book, The Cult of the All-Seeing Eye, that again connects all of these threads together. This was written in 1960 by Robert Keith Spencer. A temple will be erected in Washington, D.C. for the citizen of the world to develop universal understanding in place of his national limitations. The futuristic building, characterized as a spiritual United Nations, will be a symbol of the brotherhood and sisterhood of mankind, according to the brochure issued from Temple Headquarters, Greenwich, Connecticut. A wing of this modern-day Tower of Babel will be accorded to each of the 6 international faiths: Hinduism, Judaism, Buddhism, Confucianism, Christianity, and Islam. The symbolism planned for the building dates back to the black magic practiced by the high priests of ancient Egypt. The building will contain a giant eye, a circular pool of water which reflects light beamed onto it by a dome faceted to resemble a many-colored diamond. In New York, the Friends of the Meditation Room have long met regularly in the United Nations Meditation Room. On April 24, 1957, when the Meditation Room was reopened, the late Dag Hammarskjöld, UN Secretary General, described this pagan stone as an altar to universal religion. The altar is the symbol of the God of all, he said. The Temple of Understanding also will have its meditation room to be known as the Hall of Illumination. There it is planned that the Illuminati, Masters of Wisdom, our leaders of the Temple of Understanding, will train the public in new humanistic cult. So this is the United Nations Meditation Room, and that black cube is the symbol that they were just talking about, that this would be the symbol of the God of all. And this is yet another way that we see clearly these people are Luciferian. The cube itself is a symbol of Saturn. Saturn, of course, connects us back to Satan, or Saturnalia worship. I really find it fascinating, all of the strange things that we find surrounding this church in New York City, St. John's. We really are at a time right now where everything is being revealed. So I'll leave you with that for now, guys. As always, thank you so much for checking out my video. I hope you're taking care of yourselves out there. And stay tuned. I'll be back soon with more.